10,000 people lived on an island the size of a city block. They left in 3 months. The buildings are still standing. This is a countdown of 8 abandoned megastructures. Things built at a scale that makes no sense until you're standing in front of them, and then it makes even less sense that they're empty. 8. The ship graveyard in the desert. 60 rusting hulls sitting in sand. Not near water, not near anything really, just sitting there in what used to be the floor of the 4th largest lake on Earth, tilted at odd angles like they ran aground and the sea just forgot to come back. The Aral Sea was once enormous, larger than all of Ireland. Soviet irrigation engineers in the 1960s decided to redirect the 2 main rivers feeding it, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, toward cotton fields in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. The math wasn't complicated. The consequences apparently were. By the 1980s, the lake had lost 40% of its volume. By the early 2000s, it had split into separate fragments. The eastern basin dried up almost completely in 2014. The town of Moynac, which had been a thriving fishing port, found itself 60 miles from the nearest waterline. The boats couldn't follow the water as it retreated, so they stayed. There are roughly 30 vessels still scattered across what locals call the ship graveyard, fishing trawlers and cargo ships that once worked a living lake, now half buried in salt flats and scrub. The largest ones weigh several hundred tons. Their hulls are cracked. Paint peels in long strips. Some have been spray painted by tourists, which is somehow both understandable and bleak. The salt, by the way, doesn't stay put. Winds pick it up and carry it across the region, along with residual pesticides from decades of agricultural runoff. The Aral Sea Basin is now considered one of the worst man-made environmental disasters in history. Children in the surrounding areas grew up with respiratory problems. The fishing industry that supported tens of thousands of people simply ceased to exist. Here's what gets me about the ships specifically. They weren't abandoned because something went wrong with the ships. The ships were fine. The ships did their job. The sea left. There's a certain kind of ruin that happens because of violence or neglect or financial collapse. And then there's this. A working fleet, maintained and operational, that one day had nowhere to go and no way to follow the water retreating toward the horizon. The crews disembarked, the port authority closed, and the boats just stayed there, waiting for a tide that has now been mathematically permanently ruled out. Soviet planners knew at some level what the diversion would cost the sea. Internal reports flagged it. The projections were clear enough. The cotton targets were clearer. So the rivers were redirected, the quotas were met, and somewhere in the delta, the water table dropped and kept dropping, and nobody officially acknowledged what was happening until it was several decades too late to matter. The Uzbek government has made some attempts to restore the northern portion of the Aral Sea with dam infrastructure, and the northern section has partially recovered, water levels rising enough to support limited fishing again. The southern basin, the larger one, is still desert. The ships in Moynac are nowhere near the recovery zone. They become a tourist attraction now. People drive out across the salt flat and take photographs standing in front of the rusted hulls. The town has leaned into it. There's a small museum, a few guest houses. The ships are fenced off in places to stop people climbing on them, though the fencing isn't particularly serious about its job. At some point, the hulls will corrode completely and there'll be nothing left but impressions in the salt. The sea won't return. The fishing port is a museum, and somewhere about 60 miles east of Moynac, if the restoration project keeps going, a few small boats are working a fragment of what was once an inland ocean, catching fish in water that has crept back slowly into a basin that mostly isn't there anymore. 30 vessels, 2 rivers, one decision made in an office somewhere in Moscow in the 1960s by people who did not live anywhere near the Aral Sea. The boats are still out there. 7. The castle full of ammunition. Francis Bannerman didn't ask permission. He bought a small island in the Hudson River, about 50 miles north of New York City, and then he built a Scottish castle on it to store his weapons. Not decorative weapons, not antiques in glass cases. Francis Bannerman VI was the largest surplus military arms dealer in the United States, and after the Spanish-American War ended in 1898, he found himself in possession of more rifles, cannons, artillery shells, and loose ammunition than he had warehouse space for in Brooklyn. The city had opinions about this, so he went looking for an island. Polypel Island was small, rocky, and largely useless for anything except exactly this. Bannerman bought it in 1900 and started building almost immediately. The castle he constructed, or the structure he called a castle, which looks like someone described a Scottish fortress to a contractor who had never seen one and was working from imagination, stretched across most of the island's usable surface. Thick walls, turrets, his own name spelled out in large letters on the river-facing facade in case anyone sailing past was unclear on whose weapons depot they were admiring. At peak capacity, the island held an estimated 250 tons of military surplus, shells, powder, firearms from multiple wars across multiple continents. All of it packed into the buildings Bannerman kept expanding because the business kept growing, and the Brooklyn warehouse he still maintained was constantly full, and the island had room. Francis Bannerman died in 1918. 2 years later, in 1920, a section of the storage building exploded. Nobody was killed, which was either lucky or a testament to how few people were on a weapons island on a Tuesday. The explosion destroyed a significant portion of the structure and launched debris into the river. Some of the shells and ordnance scattered across the island. Salvage crews removed what they could. The rest stayed. The family sold the island to New York State in 1967. A fire in 1969 gutted most of what remained of the main building, leaving the walls standing but the interior open to the sky. The turrets are still there. The name is still legible on the facade, though pieces of it have crumbled. The whole thing sits in the middle of one of the most photographed stretches of the Hudson Valley, visible from Amtrak trains running between New York and Albany, close enough to see clearly from the riverbank. Kayakers paddle out to it. Tour boats pass close enough for photographs. The island is technically open for guided tours during certain seasons, though large sections remain off limits because the structural condition of the walls is not something you want to test with foot traffic. There's still ordnance on the island, not a dangerous quantity. Surveys have been done, assessments made, but the cleanup has never been fully completed, partly because the walls themselves complicate access and partly because, well, it's a small rocky island with a partially exploded castle on it, and there are other things to spend money on. Which is a sentence that applies, it turns out, to quite a lot of the structures in this countdown. The Bannerman family had a mail order catalog. You could order surplus rifles and cannonballs through the post, the same way you might order shoes. The catalog ran to hundreds of pages. At one point, it listed over 1,000 different firearms available for purchase and delivery. The island was essentially the warehouse behind the world's most alarming department store. The walls on the river-facing side are the best preserved. They're about 12 meters high in places, roughly the height of a 4-story building, and they still carry the original stonework detailing. Stand on the opposite bank on a clear day, and it looks almost plausible as an actual castle. Almost. The Hudson River freezes in winter in that stretch, or used to more reliably than it does now. There are photographs from the early 1900s of the island in ice, the castle walls rising out of a white plain surrounded by nothing. A Scottish fortress built by an arms dealer in the middle of a New York river because the city of Brooklyn had objections to the alternative. The exploded section has been like that for over 100 years. What's at number 6? The vacation pods that kept killing people. Before a single tourist ever checked in, the Sanji UFO houses had already claimed several lives during construction, and the Taiwanese government's response when the project finally collapsed was to bulldoze the entire site without conducting a single archaeological survey or preserving so much as one pod for the record. They were built starting in 1978 on the northern coast of Taiwan near the town of Sanji. The design was genuinely strange. Circular pod-shaped units stacked in clusters elevated on stilts above a landscaped resort area painted in bright colors facing the ocean. They looked like something a production designer would build for a science fiction film set in an optimistic future. The developer, a company called the Sanji Seashell Company, envisioned them as a luxury retreat, primarily for American military officers stationed in the region. Construction stopped in 1980. The reasons given were financial, cost overruns, a collapse in the target market after the United States normalized relations with mainland China and reduced its military presence in Taiwan. The resort had never opened. The pods sat empty. Over the following decades, the site became something else entirely. Stories spread. Workers killed during construction, accidents that couldn't be explained away, a sense that the land itself had objected to what was being built on it. Some accounts connected the site to a nearby dragon sculpture that had been destroyed during road construction before the resort was planned, which in Taiwanese folk belief carries serious consequences. None of this was official. All of it circulated anyway. The pods deteriorated steadily through the 1980s and 90s. Paint faded. Structures cracked. Vegetation pushed through the concrete. Photographers started making the trip out to document them, and the images, clusters of weathered saucers against a gray Pacific sky, spread widely enough that Sanji became one of the more photographed abandoned sites in Asia before most people outside Taiwan had heard of it. If this is the kind of thing that gets you, drop a like, leave a comment. It genuinely helps. Now, back to it. The government announced demolition in 2008. The stated reason was redevelopment. The land had value, and the crumbling pods were a liability. Preservationists pushed back, arguing that the site was architecturally significant, that the pod design represented a specific moment in Taiwanese modernism that existed nowhere else in quite that form, and that demolition without documentation was irreversible in a way that couldn't be undone once the machines moved in. The machines moved in. The pods came down. No comprehensive archaeological or architectural survey was completed before demolition. A few photographs exist, some video footage. That's the archive. The land sat largely empty for years afterward. Multiple redevelopment proposals came and went. Investors announced plans and then quietly withdrew them. Whether this was coincidence or the power of a story that had taken on its own momentum is a question the data doesn't answer cleanly. What got built there eventually was a water park. The pods themselves had a specific quality that photographs captured well. The way the circular windows looked like eyes. The way the elevated platforms gave each cluster a slightly predatory stance above the landscape. The way the ocean sat behind all of it as a flat gray backdrop on overcast days. Dozens of photographers documented the site in its final years, and their images are now the only detailed record of what the structures actually look like up close. The original architectural drawings are not publicly accessible. The developers' records, to the extent they exist, haven't been released. The construction workers who died on site, accounts vary on how many, and the official figures were never clearly stated, left no memorial. The water park reportedly opened to reasonable local interest. The coastline is scenic. The site is busy in summer. Somewhere under the car park or the wave pool or whatever sits closest to where the pod stood, there may still be foundation work from 1978. Concrete poured for a future that lasted 2 years and left almost nothing behind except the photographs and the stories, and the persistent fact that nobody wanted to build anything there for quite a long time after the saucers came down. The dragon sculpture, for what it's worth, has never been rebuilt. Consider number 5, the naval base 200 miles from the ocean. Not because the Navy made a navigational error. The Salton Sea Naval Air Facility existed in the middle of the California desert by design, because the lake below it was so contaminated, so biologically hostile, so thoroughly poisoned by agricultural runoff that it made a perfect testing ground for weapons that weren't supposed to hit anything living. The Salton Sea itself is an accident. In 1905, an irrigation canal feeding farmland in the Imperial Valley broke, and for the next 2 years, the Colorado River poured uninterrupted into a low desert basin, creating a lake roughly 35 miles long and 15 miles wide, about the size of Lake Tahoe, sitting at 220 feet below sea level in one of the hottest places in North America. For a few decades, it was actually a resort destination, yacht clubs, waterfront hotels. Frank Sinatra reportedly performed near its shores. Migratory birds found it and kept coming. The 1950s and early 1960s treated it as a success story, a manufactured lake that had somehow become an ecosystem. Then the salt content kept rising because the lake has no outlet. Every drop of water that flows in eventually evaporates, leaving its mineral content behind. Agricultural drainage brought fertilizers and pesticides. By the 1980s, fish were dying in mass events. Millions of tilapia washing up on the shore, the smell carrying for miles, the white crust of dead fish bones becoming a permanent feature of the waterline. The Navy had arrived well before the collapse. The facility used the lake's airspace and surface for testing sea-to-air missile systems. Specifically, the lake's remoteness and the near-total absence of civilian boat traffic made it ideal for live fire exercises that would have been complicated elsewhere. The facility was operational through the Cold War period and handled classified testing programs that weren't publicly documented until decades later. What the base looks like now depends on which section you're standing in. Parts of it have been absorbed into other uses. Parts are simply sitting there. Concrete pads, equipment foundations, rusted infrastructure, gradually being reclaimed by the same hyper-arid conditions that made it useful in the first place. The lake visible from the site has shrunk measurably since the base was active, the shoreline retreating to expose a gray-white flat of dried sediment and agricultural chemicals. The sediment is the part that keeps getting worse. As the Salton Sea shrinks, and it has been shrinking steadily since the early 2000s when the agricultural water agreements that fed it were renegotiated, the exposed lakebed releases fine particulate matter into the air. This dust carries selenium, pesticides, and heavy metals accumulated over a century of farming. Communities in the Coachella Valley, many of them low-income and largely Latino, have some of the highest rates of childhood asthma in California. The connection to the lakebed dust has been studied at length. A state restoration plan has existed in various forms for roughly 2 decades. Funding has arrived in pieces, several $100 million allocated in recent years, not close to what independent estimates suggest full remediation would cost. Meanwhile, the lake loses roughly 1 vertical foot of depth per year. The weapons testing facility and the dying lake occupy the same frame now. The launch pads where missiles were fired over water that no longer reaches that far sit in the same landscape as the dry shoreline and the asthma statistics. There's something almost too neat about that, except it isn't neat at all. It's just the same piece of land bearing the weight of several different decisions made by several different institutions across 120 years, none of which were coordinating with each other, all of which assumed someone else would deal with the downstream consequences. Standing at the old facility perimeter, looking south toward where the water used to reach, you're looking at a shoreline that has moved roughly 5 miles since the base was active. The birds still come, millions of them, because the Salton Sea sits on the Pacific Flyway and there's nowhere else for migrating species to stop in that stretch of desert. They land on a lake that is 30 times saltier than it was 60 years ago. The missiles are long gone. The salt isn't going anywhere. Hashima, Entry 4, the island that held its breath. At its peak, 13,000 people per square kilometer lived on Hashima Island. To put that in physical terms, the entire population of a small city, compressed onto a concrete platform roughly the size of 2 city blocks, surrounded by open ocean, with nowhere to go except up. The buildings went up. Some of them reached 9 stories, among their earliest reinforced concrete residential towers ever built in Japan, constructed starting in the 1910s when Mitsubishi was pulling coal from a seam directly beneath the island floor. The coal was the reason for all of it. The island had none. Mitsubishi built the island over the coal, encasing the original rock in concrete, raising seawalls, stacking apartment blocks and school buildings, and a hospital and a cinema, until what had been a small uninhabited outcrop in Nagasaki Bay became something that looked, from a distance, like a battleship steaming toward the horizon. That's where the nickname came from. Gunkanjima, Battleship Island. The density figure, 9 times that of Manhattan's most crowded neighborhoods, wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was the deliberate result of needing workers as close as possible to the mine shaft on an island with a fixed footprint and no room to spread outward. Families lived in apartments roughly the size of a large parking space. Communal areas were shared by hundreds. The rooftop of one building connected to the entrance of the next. Coal production peaked around 1960, when roughly 5,000 people were living on the island. The number had dropped from earlier highs as automation reduced the labor requirements, but the community remained dense, functional, and largely self-contained. Hashima had its own school system, its own shops, its own Buddhist temple. Children grew up there, married there, had children there. Japan shifted to petroleum in the 1960s. The transition happened over roughly a decade, and Hashima felt it in the most concrete possible way. The coal stopped being worth extracting. Mitsubishi announced closure in January of 1974. By April, the island was empty. 5,000 people relocated in the space of 3 months. They took what they could carry and left the rest: furniture, clothing, books, school supplies. Because there was no practical way to remove it all, and because nobody believed they were leaving permanently. The buildings have been deteriorating ever since. The seawalls which had kept the island habitable require maintenance they no longer receive. Sections of the concrete have crumbled into the ocean. Several of the apartment towers have partially collapsed, their interiors open to the weather, the furniture, and personal effects of the last residents slowly composting into the floors. Japan submitted Hashima as part of a UNESCO World Heritage nomination in 2015, a nomination covering sites related to Japan's Meiji-era industrialization. It passed. The listing was controversial almost immediately. The reason: Hashima's coal was mined in part by Korean and Chinese forced laborers during the Second World War, conscripted under Japan's wartime mobilization policies, and held on the island under conditions that survivors and historians have documented in considerable detail. Japan had agreed, as part of the UNESCO process, to acknowledge this history at the site. The acknowledgement that followed was, depending on who you ask, either insufficient or absent entirely. South Korea's government said it fell short. The debate has continued at diplomatic level for years. The island sits in Nagasaki Bay, about 15 kilometers from the city where one of the 2 atomic bombs of the Second World War was dropped in August of 1945. Some of Hashima's workers were among the Hibakusha, the survivors of that bomb. The distance is small enough that the blast was audible on the island. Guided boat tours run to Hashima regularly now, weather permitting. Visitors walk a small designated path along one edge of the island and look at the buildings from a distance. They can't enter the structures. The collapse risk is too high. Photographers with longer lenses document the interiors through open windows. The peeling walls, the collapsed ceilings, the children's desks still visible in the schoolrooms. The seawall is holding for now. The concrete towers are not. In another generation, the structures that remain may not be distinguishable from the island's original rock. Mitsubishi still exists. Hashima is a heritage site. The forced labor memorial that was promised has not been built, the 3rd largest hole ever dug by human hands. Mirny Diamond Mine sits in the Sakha Republic in eastern Siberia, and the numbers attached to it are the kind that require a frame before they make sense. 525 meters deep. That's roughly the height of the Empire State Building inverted into the earth, 1.2 kilometers across at the surface, wide enough that if you stood at one rim and shouted toward the other side, the person standing there would be a dot. Soviet geologists found the kimberlite pipe in 1955. By 1960, the mine was in full operation, running 3 shifts a day through winters where temperatures dropped to minus 60 degrees Celsius, cold enough that tires shattered like ceramic and oil congealed in engines before they could be started. Workers used jet engines mounted on vehicles to thaw the permafrost before they could dig it. A jet engine, pointed at the ground, because it was the most practical option available. The mine produced diamonds for decades, an estimated 10 million carats of gem-quality stones per year at peak production, with much larger volumes of industrial-grade material. At its height, Mirny was producing roughly a quarter of the world's diamond supply. The city of Mirny grew up around it. Hospitals, schools, apartment blocks, all built on permafrost, all serving a workforce that existed entirely because of the hole. Open pit mining stopped in 2001. The ore body had been worked down past the point where open-cut extraction was economical, so operations shifted underground, following the kimberlite pipe deeper. The pit itself was simply left, a void the size of a small city, in the middle of Siberia, open to the sky. The downdraft is the detail that doesn't quite register until you think about it. A hole that size generates its own localized air current, as temperature differences between the pit floor and the surface create circulation patterns. Helicopters are formally prohibited from flying over Mirny Mine because the downdraft is strong enough to pull small aircraft in. There are accounts of incidents, helicopters that drifted too close and found themselves descending faster than they were climbing. A pit that can eat helicopters. Nobody put that in the brochure. The underground operation continued until 2017, when the mine was suspended following a flooding incident that forced the evacuation of workers from the lower levels. The specific cause involved groundwater infiltration, compromising the lower shaft infrastructure. At the time of suspension, the underground workings extended to a depth of approximately 1 kilometer below the original surface, meaning the total vertical extent of the excavation, from the top of the open pit to the bottom of the underground workings, was somewhere approaching 1.5 kilometers. It has not reopened. Alrosa, the Russian state diamond company that operates the mine, has periodically announced intentions to resume operations. As of the most recent public statements, the flooding issue had not been resolved to the point where resumption was viable. The city of Mirny, meanwhile, faces a problem that predates the mine suspension and has been accelerating alongside it. The permafrost under the built environment is thawing. Climate change in Siberia has been running at roughly 3 times the global average rate of warming, and the consequences for a city built entirely on frozen ground are not theoretical. Buildings tilt, roads buckle, infrastructure sinks as the substrate beneath it loses its structural integrity. The apartment blocks built in the 1960s and 1970s, built to house the mine workforce, built fast, built on permafrost that was assumed to be permanent, are developing cracks and subsidence issues that require constant maintenance to manage. Some structures have been condemned. The population of Mirny has been declining for years, a slow evacuation driven by economics and by the basic physics of frozen ground that is no longer reliably frozen. Stand at the rim of the pit and look down. The walls are cut in wide spiraling terraces. The haul road that heavy vehicles used to drive from the surface to the floor and back again. A road that descends in a helix for roughly 8 kilometers of total length to cover 525 meters of vertical distance. At the bottom, the pit is in permanent shadow for most of the year. The floor holds standing water now, a dark pool reflecting whatever light reaches it. The town behind you is still occupied. Fewer people every year, but still there. The pit isn't going anywhere. 2. The hotel that appeared on no maps. For 16 years, the government of North Korea officially denied that a 105-story skyscraper existed in the middle of their capital city. The Ryugyong Hotel is visible from almost everywhere in Pyongyang, a concrete pyramid rising 330 meters into the sky, roughly the height of the Chrysler Building. And for a significant portion of its construction history, it simply wasn't there. Not on official maps, not in state photographs, not acknowledged in any government publication. Construction began in 1987. The target was to have the building operational by 1989 in time for the World Festival of Youth and Students that Pyongyang was hosting. At the time, the design, a tapering triangular tower with 3 wings meeting at a central core, clad eventually in glass, would have made it one of the tallest hotels on Earth. Roughly 3,000 rooms spread across 105 floors, with revolving restaurants planned for the upper levels. Construction stopped in 1992. The building was a bare concrete shell, visibly incomplete, dominating the Pyongyang skyline from every direction. The regime had run out of money. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The hard currency that had been funding the project simply stopped arriving. For the next 16 years, the shell stood there, empty, concrete darkening with weather and age. No windows, no cladding. Just the raw structure, which engineers who have examined available photographs have described as potentially compromised. The concrete poured during the initial construction phase was of uncertain quality, and standing unstressed for over a decade in a climate with significant freeze-thaw cycling is not what reinforced concrete is designed to do. A North Korean tourism brochure from the 1990s, distributed internationally, contained an airbrushed photograph of the Pyongyang skyline with the Rugyeong Hotel simply removed. Not obscured, removed. The sky filled in behind where the building stood. The building that was impossible to miss from street level in the city it supposedly didn't exist in. Construction resumed in 2008, reportedly funded by an Egyptian telecommunications company called Orascom that had negotiated mobile network rights in North Korea. The exterior glass cladding, blue-green reflective panels, was applied to the building's facade between roughly 2011 and 2013, transforming the structure from a bare concrete ghost into something that at least photographed as a finished building. The interior has never been opened. No guests have stayed there. No restaurants have operated. The revolving elements that were planned for the upper floors have not been installed, or if they have, no outside observer has confirmed it. The building has electricity. Lights have been photographed on in upper floor windows at night. But whether those lights illuminate anything habitable or simply run through empty corridors is not something anyone outside the government knows. Structural engineers reviewing available satellite and photographic data have raised questions about whether the building is salvageable. The concerns center on the original concrete, poured quickly, possibly with poor quality control, then left to stand without load for over 15 years before construction resumed. Concrete that stands unstressed can develop internal fractures that aren't visible from the exterior. The glass facade, whatever else it achieves, does not resolve the question of what the structure beneath it is actually capable of bearing. The height matters here. 330 meters is not a minor engineering margin for error. A failure in the structural concrete at that scale is not a localized problem. North Korea has never released structural engineering assessments of the building. Foreign engineers have not been permitted to conduct inspections. The building sits in the capital of a closed state, and the information available about its actual condition is, essentially, what can be inferred from photographs taken from a distance. Pyongyang has grown around it over the decades. New apartment towers, new civic buildings, a riverfront development visible in recent satellite imagery. All of it with the Ryogyong sitting in the middle of the skyline, blue-green glass panels catching the light, every window on every floor dark. The official name translates roughly as Capital of Willows. It appears on maps now. It has appeared on maps since the construction resumed. The 16-year gap in the cartographic record is not discussed. 3,000 rooms, 0 guests, 37 years and counting since the first concrete was poured. 1. Buzluja, Bulgaria, 1981. A communist-era monument the size of a sports arena, built on the highest accessible peak in the Balkan Mountains, shaped like a flying saucer, decorated with mosaics that took a decade to complete and cost more per square meter than anything else built in Bulgaria during the entire communist period. The building doesn't announce itself gradually. You drive up a mountain road and then you turn a corner, and it's just there. A concrete disc, roughly 70 meters in diameter, sitting on a tapered concrete stem rising from the ridgeline with a tower behind it that stands another 70 meters above the saucer itself. The whole assembly looks like something that landed and decided to stay. The mountain below it falls away in every direction. Buzluja was built to commemorate the founding of the Bulgarian Social Democratic Party, which took place on that specific mountain peak in 1891. The location was deliberately chosen for its symbolism, the mountain where the movement began, now crowned with a monument to what that movement had supposedly become. Construction took roughly 7 years, with workers and volunteers brought in from across the country to lay the mosaics and pour the concrete and haul materials up a road that was itself built specifically for the project. The interior, at completion, was a circular hall lined with tens of thousands of hand-laid mosaic tiles depicting scenes of Bulgarian communist history, socialist ideals, and prominent figures of the movement. The ceiling alone, a domed space roughly 40 meters across, required years of work by artists and craftspeople. The colors were vivid, the detail was extraordinary. At the center of the ceiling, a hammer and sickle roughly 5 meters across in red and gold tile. The Bulgarian communist government fell in 1989. By the mid-1990s, Buzluja had been stripped of anything removable: copper wire, furniture, mechanical systems, and the roof had been breached in multiple places. Within a decade of completion, the building that had cost so much and taken so long was open to the weather: snow, wind, freeze-thaw, cycling at altitude. The mosaic tiles began to fall. By the time serious photographic documentation of the interior began circulating internationally, somewhere in the early 2000s, the ceiling was already in partial collapse. Sections of mosaic had fallen to the floor. Water stains ran down the remaining tiles. The hammer and sickle at the center of the dome was cracking. Urban explorers began making the trip in significant numbers, and the images they brought back: the vast circular hall, the fallen tiles, the remnants of the murals still vivid in places where the roof had held, spread widely enough that Buzluja became one of the most recognized abandoned sites in the world, without most people being able to tell you where it was. The Bulgarian government has, for roughly 3 decades, been unable to agree on what to do with it. The building is technically state property. Restoration has been discussed and proposed and partially funded and stalled and revisited and proposed again. The Buzluja monument sits in a legal and administrative gray zone where responsibility is acknowledged but action doesn't follow. A foundation called the Buzluja Project was established to push for preservation and has made genuine progress. Emergency stabilization work has been done on sections of the roof. Funding has been secured in pieces from European cultural preservation programs, and the building was added to the World Monuments Fund watch list in 2014. The watch listing brought attention and some resources. The fundamental question of who owns the restoration obligation and who pays has not been cleanly resolved. The tower is still standing. So is the saucer. The access road, built for construction in the 1970s, deteriorates a little more each winter and is repaired unevenly. Getting inside the building without authorization has been for years straightforwardly easy. The main entrance doors have been sealed and unsealed multiple times. People get in through gaps in the structure. They have been getting in through gaps in the structure for long enough that the interior condition has been shaped partly by weather and partly by decades of unsupervised foot traffic. The tiles that are still on the ceiling are, in places, still vivid: crimson, cobalt, gold, against concrete stained gray-brown by water and age. Someone laid those tiles by hand, one at a time, over the course of nearly a decade. Some of them are still there. Some of them are on the floor. And somewhere in an office in Sofia, the question of what to do about the rest of them is still apparently under consideration.